Hi, my name is Johannes Glückler, and jointly with my colleagues Denise Gutiérrez and Claudio López de Lérida, we have started a collaborative research project that is dedicated to the nexus between public procurement and new qualities of regional economic development, in the case of Latin America. Public procurement is a very important element in any national economy. If you look at the graph on this slide, you will see that amongst the countries in the OECD, up to 20% of GDP is the spending that the government does through the channels of public procurement. You could say that governments are the biggest shoppers in their national economies, and therefore they have a strong impact on how the economy can develop. Public procurement is used to provide for public infrastructure, deliver services, and support administrative functions in ways that maximize value for money, promote competition, and minimize corruption. Of course, being such a big sector, public procurement has received loads of different research perspectives across the disciplines of the social sciences. But also recently, in our own field, economic geography, there has been a growing interest in the role of public procurement in innovation and also in the role of public procurement in local economic development. The most recent development, and that is the focus that we would like to have on that project, is that secondary objectives become increasingly important. Usually, the primary objectives of public procurement are exactly what I said before: to comply with efficient, effective use of tax money and provide for the best services available for money. But secondary objectives actually pursue a different qualitative objectives. They speak about how these services and works should actually be accomplished. We here distinguish three important secondary objectives. The first one being endogenous development, that is, promoting local businesses. Secondly, sustainable development, meaning that companies should be certified according to environmental standards or use environmentally certified materials for their production. And finally, inclusiveness or inclusive development, referring to the inclusion of small and micro businesses in public sector tenders, for example, and also the inclusion of women-led companies. Now, to study how the reform or the re-regulation, the insertion of these secondary objectives in the regulations translates into institutionalized practices at the local level of public procurement is something that requires theoretical framing. And the framing that we use is a comparison between institutions and regulations, for which this matrix here makes 4 distinctions. Institutions can either be convergent with regulations, when regulations can be either strongly enforced or non-enforced, and institutions can also contradict or divert from the content of regulations that are either enforced or non-enforced. So how would this be observable in an empirical research design? The first case is the one where institutions converge with enforced rules. So the example here is that we do have an established institutionalized practice that is legitimate, and in addition to that, in a certain moment in time, there is a new law issued in line with that institution. It's an institution reinforcing rule. The reverse case is true if there is a regulation newly issued, and after that, the institution adapts or complies with that kind of ruling, which is a rule-reinforcing institution. In the case of divergence, we could observe, for example, that although a law gets issued in a certain moment in time, the actual practices contradict the content of that rule. That's why they're colored red in this example, and divert from that rule. Another situation is the one in which institutions convert on non-enforced regulations. So regulations are relatively weak, but the institutions do the job instead of that. This would be a case in which we do have legitimate institutionalized practices without actually enforceable regulations. And finally, there is a situation in which institutions, again, divert from non-enforced regulations. And that could be a case where there is illegitimate, for example, corruptive behavior in the institutionalized practices, a law against corruption, but the behavior readapts to the new regulations and continues to be corrupt. That is the theoretical framing, and it opens a space for empirical analysis. But I will hand over now to my colleague Denise, who will explain what strategy we have to actually assess this empirically in the context of Chile and Peru.
In this talk, we focus on the following research question. How have legal reforms of public procurement affected procurement practice at the local level in Chile and Peru? To answer that question, we need to understand two levels. The first one is to understand how regulations have evolved over time, and that is a research that our colleague Claudio Lopez is performing. The second level is the level of practices, how these reforms have affected practices and how is the nature of those practices. For that, we need to understand the procurement process. Suppose a school needs to be built in a certain place. For that, first, you need to pick a procurement method. It can be a public tender, private tender, framework agreement, etc. For a school, because of the amount of money involved, the method to be chosen is public tender. The public tender is a process where governmental entities invite suppliers to submit offers for goods, services, or public works. In Chile and Peru, we have more than 3,000 entities procuring. After that, these entities call for bids. In these bids, they describe what are the requirements for that work. In Chile, we have more than 34 million documents in which we can have information about the criteria for this. Then, these entities receive the bidder offers. These offers contain the names of the bidder, national ID number, geographical information, etc. In these countries, we have more than 3,000 bidders. Finally, we have the information of who wins the tender. In Chile and Peru, we have in total more than 40 million transactions. Now we are going to show you some of the exploratory findings for local public procurement. Here we have in the y-axis, we have the transactions per capita. And in the y-axis, we have the percentage of those transactions that were awarded to local suppliers. The interesting observation here is that it doesn't matter what is the intensity of those transactions. We have this municipality here with the same intensity of this municipality here, but we see that the share of the awards given to local suppliers is so different between the two of them. This is an interesting finding because it gives us a space to explore why is this the reason. Is because of the institutionalized practices, or it is because other reasons. This is an interesting observation. However, we are not still at the stage of this research to explain this kind of observations. This is the task of this project, with the hypothesis that the differences in these places can be related to different institutional practices. To conclude, this is just a preliminary view of a project that has more ambitious goals. The first one is to understand the interactions between regulations and institutions. The second one is to evaluate the impact of procurement with secondary objectives on regional development. And last, advance our theoretical understanding about institutions and regional development. Thank you for your attention.